It was late in the fall when it all started. The air had turned crisp, and the Appalachian mountains were cloaked in their signature mist, with the dense forest stretching out as far as the eye could see. I had just moved into a small cabin deep in the heart of those mountains, hoping to find some peace after a difficult year. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city to escape the constant grind of life and find solace in the quiet. The cabin was old, built by a family that had lived in the area for generations, and it had a certain charm to it. The wood creaked as the wind passed through the cracks, and the fireplace always seemed to crackle with warmth. But as I settled in, I began to feel something wasn't right. It was the kind of unease you can't shake, like a shadow that lingers just out of sight. I didn't know much about the area at first, but it didn't take long before the locals started talking. The town nearby was small, barely more than a collection of old houses and a few stores. People there didn't speak much to strangers, and when they did, they always seemed to avoid eye contact, as though they were hiding something. I remember walking into the general store one morning, looking to pick up some supplies. The clerk, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, barely acknowledged me when I came in. I wasn't in a hurry, so I wandered the aisles for a bit. When I finally went to the counter to pay, I noticed she was watching me, her gaze unwavering. There was something about the way she looked at me that sent a chill down my spine. "You new around here?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp like a warning. "Yeah, just moved into the cabin up on Ridge Road," I replied, trying to sound casual. Her eyes narrowed. "You've heard about the Ridge, haven't you?" I shook my head, confused. "They say the mountains have a way of taking people," she continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "People who wander too far, people who don't belong, they don't always come back the same. Sometimes they don't come back at all." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the eerie vibe that was starting to settle over me. "I'm sure it's just local folklore. I'm just here to get some peace and quiet." The woman didn't smile. "It's not just folklore, son. It's real. Watch yourself out there." I paid for my items and left, but her words stuck with me. That night, as the wind howled outside, I sat by the fire, wondering if there was any truth to what she'd said. But I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. I was just a guy looking to escape. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling feeling only grew. Strange things started happening in the cabin. At first, it was small things. Objects moved from where I'd left them, the sound of footsteps upstairs when no one was there. But it escalated quickly. One night, I was woken by a loud bang, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening. The silence that followed was deafening, and then I heard it. The sound of something scratching at the walls, like claws dragging across wood. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and cautiously made my way to the staircase. The scratching continued, and I could feel my pulse in my ears as I reached the top of the stairs. The floorboards creaked beneath me with every step. As I entered the room at the end of the hall, I froze. There, standing in the corner, was a shadow, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It wasn't a person. The figure seemed to be made of the darkness itself, a silhouette that swallowed the light from my flashlight. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, a sound so guttural and filled with malice that it shook me to my core. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The figure took a step forward, and I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it back down the stairs, but I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. I ran through the woods, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. My feet stumbled over the uneven ground, branches scratching at my skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from whatever that thing was. I finally collapsed by a creek, the sound of rushing water drowning out my ragged breathing. I lay there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself. When I finally returned to the cabin, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The place was cursed, I was sure of it. I packed up my things and drove into town the next morning, determined to leave that godforsaken place behind me. But when I went to the general store to tell the clerk I was leaving, she was gone. Instead, an older man with a thick beard and a weathered face stood behind the counter. I asked him about her, but he didn't know who I was talking about. Old lady's been gone for years, he said. Didn't you know? She died in that cabin you're staying in. That's why no one stays there. Her soul's still wandering the woods. Folks around here say it's cursed. A chill ran down my spine. I knew then that it wasn't just the mountains that had taken people. It was something worse, something that had been here long before I ever arrived. I left the store without another word, my mind racing. As I drove away from the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something in the rearview mirror that I couldn't see but could feel closing in. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white, but the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I dared to look behind me. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was the shadow, the same one from the cabin. Its red eyes burned into mine, and I could hear that same low growl, the one that had haunted me that night in the cabin. I never went back. I don't know what happened to that cabin or to the shadow that chased me. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I still hear the scratching sound on the walls, and I know it's not just in my head. The mountains have a way of taking people, like the woman said. I've learned that the hard way. But they don't just take your body, they take your soul too. I'll never forget the eyes of that thing, and I know it's still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too far. I only hope they'll be lucky enough to run before it's too late.
Next story.
I don't know where to start, really. Maybe it's best to start with how everything seemed normal at first. The Appalachian Mountains are quiet, peaceful even. I'd always heard the stories, how people go missing in the woods, how strange things happen in the night, how sometimes you can hear things that aren't there, but I never thought much about it. People talk, you know? They tell tales to scare you. You brush them off until something happens to you. My name's Jamie, and I grew up near the edge of the Appalachian Range in West Virginia. The kind of place where the trees seem to stretch up to the heavens, and the air always smells of pine and earth. The nights are deep, like the world just swallows up the light. It's beautiful, and it's home. At least that's what I thought before it all happened. It started about 3 months ago when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. I'd heard of some old trail through the forest, a route that used to be a path for the locals but had been abandoned for decades. People said it was cursed, though it was more of a rumor than anything anyone took seriously. I was tired of the same old routine. So on a weekend when the moon hung full in the sky, I packed up and set out alone, thinking maybe I could find something exciting, something new. I don't remember the trail's name, but it was secluded, far enough from any roads, houses, or towns to make you feel truly isolated. That's the way I liked it, away from the noise of the world. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. The air wasn't right. It was still, too still. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my nerves. I'd been on countless hikes before, and nothing strange had ever happened. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, it became harder to shake the feeling that I was being watched. You know that sensation, like someone's behind you, breathing down your neck. I'd glance over my shoulder every so often, but the trail behind me was always empty. The path wound its way up a steep hill, the trees getting denser the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the top, the sunlight was fading, and I knew I had to make camp for the night. So, I found a flat spot near a creek and set up my tent. As the last light disappeared, I sat by the fire, feeling oddly uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the trees, low and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. I froze. My heart started to pound, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the sound, it didn't have the usual rhythm of an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was nothing. The wind, maybe. Animals, maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night dragged on, and I barely slept. Every small sound made me jump. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, but there was something else, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I packed up and started walking again, my nerves stretched thin. But then I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The footprints. I hadn't seen anyone pass by, and yet there were footprints in the dirt, small, barefoot prints, like a child's. They were fresh too, still soft and not yet filled with dirt. But there was something wrong about them, the way they were spaced. They didn't match a human stride. No adult would walk like that. I knelt down, staring at them, when a voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. There was a man standing not 10 feet away, dressed in old, ragged clothes, his face pale and gaunt, like someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. His hair was long and unkempt, falling in tangles around his face. His eyes were wide and unblinking. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his lips curling into a strange, unsettling smile. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat. Something was wrong with him. There was something off about his presence, like he didn't belong in this world. His clothes, his hair, his eyes, they were all wrong. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice low, almost a whisper. I swallowed hard. "I'm just hiking," I managed to say, trying to sound calm. He didn't respond, just continued to stare. His smile grew wider, almost too wide for a human face. It made my skin crawl. I had a sudden urge to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Then he spoke again. "They won't let you leave." I froze, his words sinking into me like cold ice. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "They're watching," he said, his voice growing faint, like it was drifting away. "They'll take you." Before I could react, he turned and walked into the woods, vanishing between the trees as if he'd never been there at all. My heart raced, but there was nothing I could do. I had to get out of there. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel alone anymore. It was like there was something behind me, following me. I turned to go back down the trail, but the path was different now. The trees looked closer, the branches more twisted, and the air was thick, like the woods themselves were closing in on me. I couldn't see the way forward clearly, as if the landscape had shifted. My head spun and my vision blurred. And then I heard it again, the rustling in the trees. Only this time it was closer, much closer. I broke into a run, adrenaline surging through me, but no matter how fast I moved, the sound kept following me. The trees seemed to stretch out of the ground like arms, trying to trap me. I must have run for hours, my legs aching, my breath ragged. Finally, I reached the edge of the woods. I couldn't see the campfire or the creek, but there was a clearing ahead. I stumbled out, my heart still pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. In the clearing, there were figures. Shadows, really. They were standing still all around the edges, just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to slow down. I didn't stop until I was back at my car. I slammed the door, started the engine, and drove without looking back, my heart still racing. It's been weeks now. I haven't told anyone about what happened, not in full. It sounds too crazy, too unbelievable. I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. Something lives in those mountains. It's older than anything I've ever known. It's watching, waiting for anyone who's foolish enough to wander too far, and the worst part, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. Watching me, waiting. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to escape it.
Next story.
I still remember that night as if it were yesterday. I can't shake the feeling of dread that follows me even now. The Appalachian Mountains, they're beautiful, no doubt, but they hide secrets in their dense woods, secrets you don't want to know. I was just a kid when it happened, just 18, but I'm telling you, it changed me. I don't go up into the mountains anymore, and I sure as hell don't plan to anytime soon. It started with a camping trip, an idea my friends thought would be fun. We were young, naive, and far too excited about the thought of exploring the remote parts of the Appalachian Trail. We'd heard about the old stories, ghosts, lost spirits, things that go bump in the night, but we were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Right? It's easy to laugh off a tale told by some old-timer in town. But I'm not laughing now. There were 5 of us. Me, Matt, Sarah, Brandon, and Emily. We had this plan: hike up the trail for a couple of days, pitch tents, and just enjoy the beauty of the wild. The town of Appalachian Springs, where we were staying, was small and isolated. The locals were friendly but quiet, always giving us strange looks when we talked about the trip. They didn't seem to like the idea of us hiking too far into the woods, but we brushed it off. After all, we were all experienced hikers. What could go wrong? We set out early, packing light, but with enough supplies for 2 nights. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and the trees seemed to welcome us as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. As we hiked, we talked about everything: school, life, what we wanted to do when we left this small town behind. Emily was particularly excited about the trip, always the adventurer. "This is going to be great," she said, practically bouncing with energy. No better way to celebrate graduation than in the mountains. We didn't really see anyone else on the trail that day. It was as if the whole world was ours, silent and still. I remember the feeling that came over me around noon. Something wasn't quite right. There was a chill in the air that didn't belong, even though it was summer. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and the birds fell silent, which was unusual. In the Appalachian Mountains, the birds are usually everywhere. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. "Did anyone else notice that?" I asked, pausing for a moment. Matt glanced around, his brow furrowed. "What, the silence? Yeah, it's weird, but it's probably just the weather changing." Brandon, who was always the jokester, laughed. "Oh, great. You're not getting all superstitious on us now, are you?" I tried to shake off the unease, but as we continued, it only grew. The path became more overgrown, the trees taller and closer together, blocking out the sunlight. By the time we found a spot to camp that evening, it was almost as if the world outside the campfire's reach didn't exist. We made camp near an old stone wall, one that looked like it had been built long ago, maybe by settlers or some long-forgotten community. The stones were weathered, moss growing in between them. It felt strange, almost like we weren't supposed to be there. But we set up our tents anyway, tried to shake off the feeling, and sat around the fire. That night, the temperature dropped. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire seemed to flicker as if struggling to survive. We talked and laughed, but something in the air felt heavy, like it was pressing in on us. Around midnight, Sarah brought up the local legends. "I don't know if I believe in ghosts," she said, staring into the flames. "But my grandmother always told me about the spirits in the mountains, people who disappeared, never to be seen again, and then they'd come back, as something else." We laughed, but there was an edge to it, a nervousness. We all knew what she was talking about. The stories of the Appalachian Mountains are filled with tales of ghostly figures, lost souls, and strange creatures that lurk in the deep woods. But we were all too tough, too brave to let it get to us. Or so we thought. It was Emily who first heard it, the voice. She was sitting across from me, her face illuminated by the firelight. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but then she froze, her eyes wide. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all stopped, straining to listen. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, there was a low, mournful cry. It sounded like someone was calling out in the woods. A voice, a woman's voice, echoing through the trees. It wasn't animal, too human, too desperate. "It's just an animal," Matt said quickly, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Probably a coyote or something." But the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right on top of us. My heart began to race, my skin prickling with the sudden realization that whatever was making that sound wasn't an animal. "Should we go check it out?" Brandon asked, his bravado slipping. "No way," I said, standing up. "We stay here. We'll be fine." But I wasn't so sure anymore. The forest had grown darker, colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was like the trees themselves were leaning in, listening, waiting. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just outside the camp. We all held our breath, looking at each other, waiting for someone else to say it. "I'm going to check it out," Emily said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight and standing up. "Emily? No," Sarah cried. "It's not safe out there. We don't know what's going on." But Emily wasn't listening. She moved toward the edge of the camp, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She didn't get very far, maybe 10 feet, when the cry came again, this time so close it made my blood run cold. "Help. Me? Please." We all stood frozen, watching as Emily's face turned pale. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. But before she could move, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, and she stumbled back, falling to the dirt. There was something in the shadows, something that had moved too quickly for any of us to see. "Emily," I yelled, rushing toward her. But when I got there, she wasn't alone. A figure had emerged from the darkness, a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes empty and hollow. She was staring at Emily as if she were searching for something, her hands outstretched, her voice still calling out, low and mournful. We all froze, too terrified to move, and then the woman spoke in a voice that didn't sound human. "You shouldn't have come." And just like that, she vanished, melting back into the shadows. We grabbed Emily, dragged her back to the camp, and tried to keep the fire alive, though none of us dared sleep. We kept hearing the footsteps, the voice, but we didn't dare move. By the time the sun rose, we packed up and left without a word. I don't know if we'll ever really understand what happened that night. I tried to go back to the town to find answers, but the locals wouldn't speak of it. They all just looked away when I asked, and the stories, they were always the same. People who go too deep into the mountains, they disappear. The ones who come back, they're never quite the same. I don't go near those mountains anymore. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear that voice in my dreams, calling out to me. And when I wake up, I can still feel those cold, empty eyes on me, watching, waiting. You can laugh off ghost stories you want, but trust me on this. Some things in the Appalachian Mountains aren't meant to be found.
Next story.
I had never been so sure of something in my life. I was going to prove it wrong. That's what kept running through my head as I stood at the edge of the Appalachian forest, ready to venture into the very heart of the wilderness. People told me about the curse, the stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, warnings from locals about the whistling woods. They said that anyone who went too far into the forest past a certain point would never return the same. Some didn't return at all. But I didn't believe it. Not for a second. I was a rational person. I studied folklore in college, debunking myths and unraveling the mysteries behind old ghost stories and legends. This was no different. It was all in their heads, just fear of the unknown. I had to prove it. It was late October, the air crisp and cool, a slight breeze rustling the fallen leaves around me. The trees were thick, their bark a deep brown, their leaves starting to turn yellow and red. I wasn't going to spend the night in the woods. That was never my plan. I'd be back before dark, taking only a few hours to hike deep into the area where the whispers of the curse seemed to originate. I'd take some photos, maybe even a few video clips, showing how utterly normal the place was. The hike started easy enough. The trail was well-worn, surrounded by thick forest, the kind you only see in old pictures. It was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't let it bother me. I pressed on, the rustling of my boots on the dry leaves the only sound I could hear. That's when I first heard it, a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. Whistling. It was soft at first, a distant, almost pleasant tune, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The tune wasn't familiar. There was a strange cadence to it, like it was teasing me, pulling me further into the woods. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the path behind me was empty. I'd been hiking for over an hour by that point. I shrugged it off. Probably some bird or animal, I thought, or maybe it was just the wind. But as I kept walking, the sound persisted, growing louder, coming from all directions, surrounding me. It was as if the very air was filled with it. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept racing. What kind of animal whistles like that? I quickened my pace. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the trees grew taller, their branches weaving together, blocking out the sky. My heart started to race. I felt that creeping sensation at the back of my neck, the one you get when someone is watching you. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It was coming from my left, deeper into the woods. I couldn't make out the source of the whistling, but it was so distinct. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. And it was so close. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My words seemed to disappear into the silence, no response. I hesitated for a moment, then moved forward. My instincts were telling me to turn back, but my curiosity overpowered them. What was making that sound? I stepped off the main trail, following the whistling. The path was no longer clear, the underbrush thickening as I pushed forward. The air felt different here, colder somehow, and the further I walked, the more oppressive the forest became. I could barely see the sky through the dense canopy of leaves above me. It was like the trees themselves were closing in, suffocating any light that tried to break through. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just ahead of me, partially obscured by the trees. The whistling stopped. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. His back was turned and he was standing very still, almost unnaturally so. His clothes were ragged, covered in dirt, like he'd been out here for years. His hair was wild and unkempt, falling over his face, but there was something odd about him, something unnatural. I couldn't put my finger on it. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but the words caught in my throat. Something told me not to speak. Then he turned around. His eyes were wide, pale, almost translucent, and his face was not right. It was twisted, stretched, like someone had pulled his skin too tight. There was no expression on his face, just emptiness. A void. "Who are you?" I was trembling, but I didn't even know why I asked. My instincts were screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He didn't speak, but his lips moved barely. And in the silence, I heard it. The whistling. It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from all around me. From the trees, from the wind, from every crack in the earth itself. The sound grew louder, dissonant, like 1,000 voices blending together into one eerie, unnatural tune. My head started to spin, and I had to hold on to the nearest tree to steady myself. The world seemed to shift, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever was happening here. The man, if that's what he was, took a step toward me. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, the whistling grew louder until it was deafening. The air around me vibrated with it. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering in my ears. Something was wrong. So wrong. This wasn't just a man. It wasn't anything human. It was like the forest itself was alive, feeding on my fear, using that whistling to pull me in, to trap me here. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Every step I took felt like the ground was trying to swallow me whole. The trees seemed to stretch toward me, their branches like fingers reaching for my skin. The whistling followed me, getting louder, faster. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in my head, twisting my thoughts, clouding my mind. When I finally broke free from the trees and reached the trail again, I looked around, my chest heaving with panic. The sun was setting. I had been gone for hours, but it felt like I had just entered the woods. It was like time had warped out there, like I had stepped into something that shouldn't exist. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the town. And when I told the locals what had happened, they looked at me like they already knew. They weren't surprised. They told me I had ventured too far into the whistling woods, that once you hear the whistling, there's no going back. That I had encountered the spirits of the forest, the ones that lure people in, never to let them leave. I don't know what I saw that day, but I know one thing for sure. There are things in the Appalachian wilderness that shouldn't be disturbed. And if you ever hear the whistling, turn around. Don't look back. Just run. Because if you stay, you may never leave.
Next story.
I've always been one to dismiss the stories people tell about the Appalachian Mountains. There are so many myths, so many ghost tales. I figured they were just that. Stories. But after what happened to me, I don't know if I can ever think the same way again. What I experienced out there, it doesn't fit the usual explanations. It's something else entirely. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to head out. I've lived in the foothills of Appalachia my whole life, just outside a little town that most people would pass by without a second thought. The mountains, for all their beauty, can feel like a trap sometimes. The dense trees, the rugged paths, the silence. It all seems so inviting, but there's something unsettling about them too. I never thought much of it though. On that particular day, I was feeling restless. The sun was high in the sky and the heat was stifling. I needed to get away, even if only for a few hours. So I grabbed my pack and set off into the woods, following an old trail that I'd hiked a few times before. Nothing special, just a way to clear my head. I wasn't planning on going too far, just enough to get some peace. The trail was familiar, a winding path through the thick forest that led to a small clearing by a stream. I've always loved the sound of running water, and it's a good place to sit and think. But as I made my way deeper into the woods, something felt off. The air grew thick, and the usual chorus of birds and insects seemed muted, like something had stilled them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. But then I heard it. a faint rustling, like footsteps behind me. I stopped, my heart racing, and looked around. The trees were thick, casting deep shadows in the midday sun, but I couldn't see anyone. There was no sign of movement, no animals, nothing. I shook my head. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, or the wind. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger, that sense that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it stayed with me. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing ahead, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, someone else hiking the trail. But as I got closer, I realized it was too still, too quiet. The figure was tall, wearing tattered clothes that hung loosely from its frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but there was something about the way it stood that unsettled me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was like the air itself had frozen, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" But it didn't respond. It didn't even move. I took a step forward, trying to close the distance between us. And that's when I saw its eyes. They were wide, black, like hollow pits staring into the very core of me. I froze, my blood running cold. I've never seen eyes like that before. Empty, devoid of anything human. Then it moved. Not toward me, but sideways, shifting in a way that didn't seem natural. It stepped to the side, disappearing behind a tree. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The air seemed to thicken, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift, like the earth was changing, becoming something else. It was as if the very landscape was altering around me, warping into something dark and unfamiliar. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. But I didn't feel any sense of relief. In fact, the silence was even worse now. The birds weren't chirping, the wind wasn't blowing, everything was still, as if the world had stopped turning. I turned to leave, thinking I'd seen enough for one day, but something stopped me. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, no one. I was alone. And yet, I wasn't. The footsteps kept coming, louder now, closer, but still invisible. I started walking faster, then running, panic bubbling up in my chest. But no matter how fast I went, the footsteps kept pace. It was like I couldn't outrun them. The air felt thicker, heavier with each step I took. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing rational about what was happening. The trail seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, the path twisting in impossible directions. I couldn't find my bearings. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like hands, brushing against my skin. My breathing grew shallow, and every step I took felt like I was being dragged backward. I finally stumbled into the clearing by the stream, gasping for breath, my head spinning. The water rushed by, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence, but even that felt wrong. The stream was running too fast, the water churning violently like it was trying to escape something. And then I saw it again. The figure. It stood at the edge of the stream, its back to me, as if it had been waiting there the whole time. The hollow eyes stared into the water, unblinking. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was as though it was part of the landscape, as if it had always been there, lurking in the shadows of the mountains. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run, to leave, but the figure's voice, low and guttural, stopped me in my tracks. "You're not leaving," it said, its voice like gravel grinding in the silence. My blood ran cold. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I turned to flee, but something pulled me back, something in the air, in the ground, holding me in place. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching me with those black, empty eyes. And that's when I understood. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was something older, something that belonged to the mountains, to the land itself. And it didn't want me to leave. The world around me seemed to close in, the trees, the ground, the sky, all of it pressing in on me, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I don't know how much time passed after that, but eventually the figure was gone. The air cleared. The birds began to sing again. The water in the stream slowed to its usual gentle flow. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, breathless, shaking. My mind is still trying to make sense of what happened, but there's no explanation. I don't know if what I saw was real or if it was some kind of hallucination brought on by the isolation, the heat, or the mountain air. All I know is that something out there doesn't want people wandering too far into those woods, and I'm never going back.
Next story.
It was a crisp October evening when I decided to take a shortcut through the Appalachian woods, a route I'd never walked before. I'd been staying at a small cabin near the base of the mountains, trying to get away from the city, the noise, and the rush of life. I'd heard stories from the locals about the forest, stories that were dismissed as superstition or old wives' tales. But as the hours wore on and the sun began to dip below the horizon, I realized the shadows in the woods weren't as friendly as I'd hoped. I was out for a simple hike, a break from my day of writing and solitude. The map I had didn't show any marked trails, but I thought it would be fine. After all, the forest wasn't that dense, and I'd grown up hiking and wandering through woods like this. What could go wrong? As I walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the light dimming faster than I expected. The sun had set quicker than usual, and the shadows stretched longer, reaching across the narrow trail I was on. I felt something strange, but I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't a feeling of fear, not at first. It was more like being observed, as if the woods themselves were watching me. I shrugged it off as paranoia. After all, it was just me and the trees. But the further I went, the more intense that feeling became. There was a low hum in the air, a strange vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath my feet. I paused and looked around. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional creak of branches. But then I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I stood completely still, the whisper grew louder. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, gentle and rhythmic, like a lullaby. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere, around me, beneath me, above me. The sound was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it, but it wasn't the voice that made me freeze. It was the words. Come closer. I felt my heart skip a beat and a chill ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground as if something was holding me in place. The voice came again, softer this time, like it was coaxing me, pulling me toward something I couldn't understand. Come closer and see. I should have turned back right then. Every ounce of my being screamed at me to leave, but something about the voice intrigued me. Maybe it was the isolation I had been feeling, or maybe it was just my curiosity, but I found myself moving forward, my feet carrying me down the trail without thinking. The whispers continued, guiding me through the woods. They were always behind me, just barely out of earshot, as if they were leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. And yet, as I moved, the path seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, and the air grew colder. The forest that had once seemed welcoming now felt like a maze, a tangled web of limbs and leaves twisting around me. I kept going, my mind starting to cloud with the strange lullaby of the whispers. They spoke of things, places, names, events that made no sense, words I had never heard before. It felt like a dream, but there was no escape. The forest around me was shifting, the trees bending unnaturally, the ground becoming softer, almost spongy underfoot. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a blur between the trees, but as I moved closer, I could make out a figure, tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out of proportion. Its skin was a pale, almost translucent white, and it stood completely still, its head tilted to one side. It was staring at me, or at least, I thought it was. Its eyes were dark, black as the night, and they seemed to draw me in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the figure's gaze. The whispers intensified. I could feel them in my chest now, vibrating through my ribs, reaching deep into my bones. The figure moved, but it didn't walk. It glided. It was no longer in the spot I had seen it in, and yet I couldn't see it move. It was as if it wasn't bound by the same rules as everything else in the forest. It leaned in, its breath cold against my face, and in a voice as soft as the whispers, it spoke. Do you want to see what lies beneath? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words felt like a command, not a question. Before I could think, I was moving again, my legs carrying me toward the figure. I had no control over my body. I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. The air around me grew thick with an unnatural fog, swirling around my feet, and the trees grew closer, bending over me like sentinels. The whispers became louder and louder until they were deafening, And then, just as I was about to reach the figure, everything went silent. The forest was still, the air was thick and stagnant. I couldn't see the figure anymore, and the fog had disappeared. I was completely alone, but not truly alone. I looked down at my feet. The ground beneath me had changed. It was no longer dirt and leaves, but something darker, almost like wet stone. There were patterns carved into it, symbols, shapes that I recognized from ancient folklore. Symbols I'd studied in college that had once seemed so far removed from reality. And yet, here they were, beneath my feet. The ground began to crack. Slowly at first, then with an ominous rumble. The air grew heavier, as if the weight of the earth itself was pressing down on me. A chill ran down my spine. I turned, wanting to run, but the forest had changed again. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were twisted, gnarled shapes, their trunks writhing like serpents, their branches reaching down like claws. And then I saw it. From the cracks in the ground, something was emerging. Something long and twisted, like a root, but not quite. It was alive, and it was coming for me. I didn't wait. I ran, not looking back, knowing that whatever was behind me would follow. The path was no longer a path. It was a labyrinth. A maze that twisted and turned, shifting beneath my feet as I ran. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the heavy thud of my heart, the only sound that made sense in the chaos of the forest. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I was covered in dirt, my body shaking, my mind fractured by what I had seen. The sun was long gone and the forest was quiet again, but I knew it was never truly quiet. It never had been. The locals weren't surprised when I told them. They didn't say much, but the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. The woods had claimed others before me, and it would claim more. I left the next morning before the sun had fully risen. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Some places, some woods are better left alone.
Next story.
It was late autumn when I took a solo trip to the Appalachian Mountains. I was looking for a bit of adventure, and the idea of being alone in a cabin surrounded by the vast, untouched woods seemed like the perfect escape. I found a small cabin for rent off the beaten path, not far from a town that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. It was the kind of place where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was miles away, just the kind of isolation I craved. I arrived just as dusk was settling in. The air had that crisp, chilly bite to it, the kind of cold that feels like it's right on the edge of winter. The trees were almost bare, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Modest, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and just enough room for me to stretch out and relax. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, unpacked, and made some dinner. I had brought a couple of books and spent the evening reading, enjoying the crackling warmth of the fire. Outside, it was eerily quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly the kind of solitude I needed. But the second night, something changed. I had spent the day hiking through the forest, exploring the trails that wound through the mountain passes. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The woods had a strange energy to them, something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't that they were dangerous, but there was a presence in the air, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. I didn't feel threatened, but there was an undeniable weight on my chest as I wandered deeper into the trees. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I was exhausted. I cooked a quick dinner and settled in for another quiet night. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, I began to notice something off. At first it was small, just little things. I thought I heard something outside, a faint scraping sound, like nails on wood. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the wind. Then I heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping at the window. I hesitated, but eventually went to check, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I noticed something strange. The cabin's door, which I had locked before heading out that morning, was slightly ajar. Not enough to be wide open, but just enough to let the cold night air seep in. I closed the door, locked it again, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. But as I sat down to read, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came from the side of the cabin, where there were no trees or bushes to explain the sound. It was as though someone or something was at the window. I jumped up, heart racing, and hurried to the window. I threw back the curtain, half expecting to see some wild animal or perhaps a curious raccoon. But there was nothing. Just the dark woods stretching out into the night and the soft, haunting glow of the moon. The tapping stopped, but the air felt different now. Thick, heavy. It felt as though something was waiting for me, just beyond the threshold, watching me. I couldn't bring myself to step outside to check, not with the sensation crawling up my spine. Instead, I sat back down, trying to read, trying to ignore the cold sweat that had broken out on the back of my neck. Then, as the clock neared midnight, the sound started again. This time, it wasn't tapping, it was scratching. Long, deliberate scratches, dragging across the side of the cabin. The noise seemed to vibrate through the wood, resonating deep into my bones. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I stood frozen, my eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of it. The scratching moved. It went from one side of the cabin to the other, and then it stopped. Dead silence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then I heard something else, a whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like a woman's voice, but distorted, as though the words were being pulled through water. Help me. The voice was clear now, desperate, but I couldn't understand it. I stumbled toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. Something inside me told me I had to leave, that I couldn't stay here any longer. But when I stepped outside, I froze. There, in the distance, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. A woman, draped in white, her hair wild and tangled. She stood still, facing me, but there was no movement, no sign of life, just the pale moonlight casting an eerie glow around her. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking, but the figure didn't respond. She just stared, her face obscured by the tangled mass of her hair. I stepped forward, my feet dragging as if the earth was holding me in place. But then I stopped. A sudden, horrible realization gripped me. I didn't recognize the woman, but there was something familiar about the way she stood, something that twisted the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the woman's appearance that scared me, it was the look in her eyes, the deadness, the hollow emptiness that stared out from beneath her hair. It was the kind of look you see in the eyes of someone who has been lost for far too long, someone who has seen things no one should ever see. And then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she took one step toward me, then another. Each movement was deliberate, mechanical. And with every step, I could feel the temperature drop, the air becoming colder, heavier. I turned and bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I backed away from the window. I sat there, staring at the door, every nerve in my body screaming for me to leave. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not when something out there, something I didn't understand, was waiting. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The woman never came inside, but I could feel her presence just beyond the door, pressing against it, whispering that same desperate plea, "Help me, help me." In the morning, I packed my things and left. The sun had risen, and the woods no longer seemed as welcoming. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There, standing just at the edge of the trees, was the figure, still waiting. I've never gone back to the Appalachian Mountains since that night. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever that woman was, she's still out there, waiting for someone else to hear her call.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me and my brother, Drew, out in the Appalachian Mountains. We'd been planning it for months, eager to disconnect from everything, the stress of work, the endless cycle of responsibilities, and all the noise of modern life. We rented a cabin tucked away in the woods, a place that promised serenity and seclusion. The drive there was long, but the further we went, the more I felt the weight of the city lift off my shoulders. Drew was in a great mood, cracking jokes as we passed through small towns and winding roads. We had the whole weekend ahead of us, and nothing could ruin it. The cabin was everything we hoped for. Old, but charming, with a stone fireplace and a large wooden porch that overlooked the forest. The place had an aura of quiet solitude that felt perfect for unwinding. The mountains stretched out in every direction, their peaks shrouded in mist, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. It was a paradise in its own right. The first night was peaceful. We spent it by the fire, drinking beers, playing cards, and reminiscing about old times. The only sounds were the crackling of the wood and the occasional chirp of a night bird. The stars above us were clear, untouched by the light pollution of the city. But the second night, things took a turn. Drew was the first to notice it. We were sitting on the porch, watching the moon rise, when he turned to me, his face tight with unease. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I paused, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, there it was again. A faint, low noise, like a soft thud coming from the woods. My gut twisted, and I felt an inexplicable chill creep down my spine. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound calm. "Maybe a deer or something." But Drew wasn't convinced. He stared out into the trees, his eyes narrowed. "I don't know, man. That didn't sound like an animal." We both fell silent, straining to hear. There was nothing more for a while, just the night air and the rustling of the trees. But then the sound came again, a thud, followed by a dragging noise like something heavy being pulled through the forest. "Okay, that's not a deer," I said, standing up. "Let's go check it out." I didn't know what I was expecting, but I certainly wasn't expecting to find what we did. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the woods, the beams of light cutting through the thick trees. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and the air was heavy, the scent of the forest sharp in my nose. The deeper we went, the more I could feel something was wrong. The sounds had stopped, but the silence was worse. The woods felt too still, as though the whole forest was holding its breath. After about 10 minutes of walking, we stumbled upon something strange, a small clearing with the remnants of an old, decaying structure. It looked like the remains of a cabin, though it had long since fallen into ruin. There were bits of rotting wood scattered around, and a few stone foundations still clung to the earth. But what caught my eye wasn't the ruins. It was the tree in the center of the clearing. It was huge, ancient, with a thick, gnarled trunk that looked like it had stood there for centuries, and wrapped around its base, as if tied there by some unseen force, were a series of old tattered ropes. They were tied in knots, the way you'd tie something for a long-term hold, and they looked strange, unnatural. Drew stepped forward, clearly disturbed, his flashlight shaking slightly. "Look at this," he said, voice low. "What the hell is this doing out here?" Before I could answer, the sound came again. A deep, guttural groan like the earth itself was shifting. But this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the clearing, from the tree. My blood ran cold. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled and the ropes around the tree began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The knots started to unravel and the ropes lifted as though being pulled by invisible hands. "Drew, we need to get out of here," I said, panic rising in my chest, but Drew was frozen, staring at the tree as if hypnotized. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from behind the tree, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, if it could even be called a face, was a featureless, smooth mass of blackness. It was like staring into the void. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its presence, like it was staring directly at me, seeing straight through me. Drew took a step forward, his mouth slightly open, as though he were in a trance. "Drew, no," I shouted, but it was too late. He stepped into the clearing, moving toward the figure, and just as he did, the thing reached out, its hands stretching impossibly long to grab him. I ran forward, screaming, trying to pull him back, but before I could reach him, the figure's hand closed around Drew's arm. He screamed, but it wasn't a normal scream. It was a distorted, inhuman sound, like something was being torn apart from the inside. In one swift motion, the figure yanked him toward the tree, and Drew's body went limp as he was pulled into the darkness, swallowed by the very shadows of the forest. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching me with its empty gaze, as if waiting for something. I don't remember how I made it back to the cabin, but when I did, I locked the doors and windows, trembling uncontrollably. I tried calling out for Drew, but my voice was hoarse, and there was no answer. He was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the cabin, too afraid to sleep. The night dragged on, but I knew I had to leave in the morning. I didn't want to, but the fear that clung to me was unbearable. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things and left. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I finally found a phone and called the authorities. But when they came to the cabin, there was no trace of Drew, no sign of the figure, no rope around the tree. It was as if everything had vanished. The only thing I found was a single, tattered rope lying on the forest floor where the clearing had been. And it's been years since that night, but I haven't forgotten. I can still hear the echoes of Drew's scream in my mind. And every time I close my eyes, I see that figure waiting in the darkness of the Appalachian woods. I don't think Drew is ever coming back, but I know deep down that whatever took him, it's still out there.
Next story.
I never believed in the supernatural. I thought all those ghost stories were just tales to scare kids into staying close to home. But I learned the hard way that some things are better left unexplained. My story isn't like the usual ghost tale. No, this one is darker. A warning, really. If you're thinking about venturing into the Appalachian Mountains, think twice, because once you see what's out there, you may not be able to leave. It all started about a year ago when I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail solo. I was looking for some peace, just me and the wilderness. A fresh start after a rough year. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't need to. I figured I'd be gone for a few days, maybe a week, just to clear my head. The first few days were perfect, the kind of serenity you don't find in the city. The trees were thick, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. But there was something strange about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The farther I hiked, the more I felt like the woods were closing in around me. It was subtle at first. Little things like how the shadows seemed longer even when the sun was still high in the sky, and the silence. The forest was unnervingly quiet, especially when you're used to the usual chatter of birds and critters. But I kept going. I convinced myself it was just in my head. On the fourth day, I reached a small, secluded part of the trail, the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps. I'd read something about it in an old guidebook, something about an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods, a relic from the old days. The lure of the unknown was too strong. I decided to track it down. I followed a barely there trail, cutting through thick underbrush. After an hour or so, I found it. The cabin. The cabin. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof was sagging and the wood was weathered and rotting, but there was something oddly inviting about it. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like I was meant to be there. I stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the smell of old wood and decay. Dust covered every surface, and the floor creaked under my weight. It felt forgotten, as if time had passed the place by. I explored the rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. Nothing remarkable, really. Just some old furniture, broken windows, and a strange collection of rusted tools piled in the corner. But then in the back room I found something unusual. It was a journal, tucked into the corner, hidden behind a loose floorboard. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. Curiosity got the better of me, so I sat down and started reading. The journal belonged to someone named James Hawthorne. It was filled with strange, rambling entries. At first, it seemed like just the musings of a lonely man. But as I read deeper, things started to get darker. Hawthorne wrote about hearing voices in the woods, whispers that followed him, taunting him. He wrote about strange lights in the distance, flickering through the trees at night. And the more he wrote, the more paranoid he became. He started talking about being watched, about seeing figures in the forest, people who shouldn't have been there. It was the last entry that chilled me to the bone. James wrote about a ritual, something ancient, something evil, that was meant to bring the Watchers into the world. He said the cabin had been built on a sacred ground, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. And the Watchers, they were waiting for the right moment to cross over. I stopped reading, my hands trembling. I should have left right then, but I couldn't. The story had a grip on me. I had to know more. I searched the cabin for clues, looking for anything that would explain what I'd just read. That's when I found the symbols. They were carved into the walls of the back room, hidden beneath the layers of dust and grime. Strange, intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them for too long. They were everywhere, on the floor, the walls, even the ceiling. I couldn't make sense of them, but something about them made my stomach turn. It wasn't until I heard the noise that I realized my mistake. It was a whisper, soft at first, like a breeze moving through the trees, but then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't animals. It was a voice I couldn't understand. It felt wrong. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. Panic surged through me. I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering was getting louder, more insistent. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the light of my flashlight, I saw a figure. A tall, shadowy figure, standing still as if waiting for me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was like it was made of the darkness itself, its form flickering in and out of existence as if it wasn't fully there. The voice, it was speaking to me now. It wasn't words, it was something else, an overwhelming sensation, a feeling that filled my head. It was ancient, primal, something that shouldn't be in this world. And I knew in that moment that I had made a terrible mistake. The Watcher wasn't just a ghost, it wasn't a spirit, it was something else, something older, something that fed on fear. I don't remember how I got out of the cabin. I just remember running. Running through the woods, branches slashing at my face, the sounds of footsteps behind me, too close. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest road, where a passing car picked me up, the driver looking at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. I left the mountains that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. It wasn't just in my mind. It was in the shadows of every room, in the corners of every street, in the darkness of every night. The Watcher was still out there, and I knew it was waiting for the next soul to wander too close. It's been a year, and I haven't set foot near the mountains since that day. I don't talk about what happened. People look at me like I'm crazy when I try to explain. But I've seen it, I've felt it, and I know I'm not the only one. So if you're thinking about hiking into the Appalachian Mountains, maybe you should reconsider, because there are things out there, things that you can't explain. And once they see you, once they feel your presence, you may never get away.
Next story.
It was the middle of summer when I decided to take a trip to the Appalachian Mountains. My friends and I had been talking about it for weeks, and we figured it would be the perfect place to unwind. We rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from the chaos of the city. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the distant calls of birds. The cabin we rented was older, definitely not something you'd expect to see in a brochure, but that was part of its charm. It was rustic, isolated, and had a strange kind of history to it. There were old photographs on the walls, faded and yellowed with age, showing people who looked like they belonged to another time. The kind of people who used to live in the mountains, working the land, hunting and fishing in the streams. We settled in, unpacked our things, and began to enjoy the peace and quiet. We had a fire going in the fireplace, and the flickering light cast long shadows on the walls. As the sun set, we drank beers and joked around, telling stories of ghost encounters and urban legends. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get strange. We had spent the day hiking, exploring the nearby trails, and the night was shaping up to be like the others, relaxing and carefree. But as we sat around the fire, a strange feeling settled over the group. It started with the temperature dropping. One moment, the air was warm and comforting, but the next, it was freezing. We all exchanged looks, but no one said anything at first. Then we heard it, a faint whisper in the wind, like a voice calling out from the depths of the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but it was too clear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the woods, and it sounded like a name. "Who's messing around?" my friend Lucas asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. But no one answered. We all stood up, looking toward the tree line where the whispers seemed to be coming from. "What do you think that is?" I asked, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's just a trick of the wind, probably," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky. She was the most skeptical of us all, and even she couldn't deny the weirdness in the air. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got louder. It felt like they were circling us, like something unseen was creeping closer. I could feel my heart racing, and my instincts told me that we needed to leave, but no one else seemed to want to admit it. I don't know how long we stayed out there, but the fire had burned low, and the forest had grown even darker. I was starting to feel dizzy, like something was pressing in from all sides, and the whispering, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was as though dozens of voices were speaking all at once, too many to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate. Finally, Sarah stood up, her face pale. "I'm going inside," she said, her voice trembling. We all followed her quickly, not wanting to stay outside any longer. But as soon as we stepped through the door of the cabin, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. We locked all the doors and windows, huddling together in the living room. It didn't make sense. How could it be so quiet all of a sudden? But the feeling of unease didn't fade. It only grew. Later that night, around midnight, I heard a knock at the door. Just one, loud and firm. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the others, but they were all fast asleep, seemingly oblivious to the noise. I got up slowly, walking to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, there was nothing there. No one. Just the dark, empty woods stretching out in front of me. But then I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. There were footprints in the dirt leading up to the door. They weren't like regular footprints. These were wrong. The shape was distorted, almost like someone had dragged their feet through the mud, leaving deep, uneven impressions. And the strangest part? They weren't human. I quickly slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away, looking around the room. The others were still asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was out there, watching. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was coming from the other side of the door. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. The next day, we decided to pack up and leave. No one wanted to stay another night after what had happened. But as we were loading up the car, Lucas found something odd, something buried just beneath the cabin's porch. It was a small, weathered box, half rotted from years of being exposed to the elements. He pulled it out, dusted it off, and opened it. Inside there were old, tattered scraps of paper and a few strange trinkets. But what caught our attention was the last item in the box, a small, carved wooden figure. It was shaped like a man, but the face was twisted, contorted in agony. "Where did this come from?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Lucas said, his voice unsure. "But this doesn't feel right." We decided to leave it behind, but something in my gut told me that was a mistake. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, now just a speck in the distance. But as the mountains faded into the horizon, I thought I saw something. Someone, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. It wasn't until weeks later that we learned the history of the cabin. The locals had warned us, but we hadn't listened. The place had been built on land that had been cursed long ago, the site of an old massacre. The family that had lived there had disappeared without a trace, and some said their spirits still haunted the mountains, seeking revenge for what had been done to them. We never spoke about it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains had claimed us, even if we didn't stay long enough for them to take everything. Whatever was out there, whatever we had disturbed, was still with me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again, soft and distant, just like it was in the woods. And I know deep down that it's never truly over.